Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Julie Tokarowski. Hi. I also have Detective Oliveria here with me. I just want her to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Rafaela Oliveria. I'm a detective with the Brookline Police Department. I've been a police officer for the last 12 years, and I've worked specifically with domestic violence, sexual assault, and juvenile crime since last August. We've done this presentations a few times before for different, college groups. We've done presentations at different senior centers. We've done this presentation for different groups. We've gone to classrooms, we've gone to high schools, we've, try and get prevention out there. Without further ado, we'll begin the presentation.
This is going to be a shuffle situation. We'll be bringing that microphone back and forth.
Well, if it's easier here.
Oh, should we swap? Okay.
Oh, one can have one, one can have the other.
Can you all hear me?
Or no, but she can have that one, you can have this one. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, excellent. All right, so to start us off, this is myself and Detective Oliveria. Just some pictures so you have our formal titles here. So starting on the left, Detective Oliveria. She is the Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault, and Juvenile Detective on the Brookline Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit, which is a very cool thing to say. She started doing detective work in August, and I call her my detective partner. She sits on the DV unit with me, so a lot of my questions go right to her. And then there is myself on the right. So yes, LCSW stands for Licensed Certified Social Worker. So I'm also an RYT 200, which stands for Registered Yoga Teacher. So I actually use yoga, thank you. I use yoga as a therapeutic modality in my life and in my work. My role is domestic violence social worker and a victim witness advocate. So I wear a couple different hats on the domestic violence unit. I started that role at the end of October. So as of last week, I've officially been there 6 months, which is very cool. Next slide, please. Okay, some fun things. Detective Oliveria, I have some fun facts for you. I don't know if you saw these, but Detective Oliveria has worked with the police department for 12 years. She moved to the detectives division in August of 2023. She graduated from Smith College and has a master's from Boston University. I'll let her say the next two quotes because they make me laugh.
These are adorable. I actually have not seen these yet. I do have a pit bull. She's 3 years old, and her name is Chihiro. She looks like the dog emoji on iPhones. She is all white and has a little brown patch on her eye. I started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu last year. I'm still a white belt. I'm not that great, but I do love it as a form of stress release and exercise and community. I do train with some other people in my department as well, and I do love Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
I was pretty proud of these facts from what I know. I put them in on Monday. Okay, so turning to myself, I use the she series of pronouns. I want to mention that I use the she, her series of pronouns just so that we're all aware. I have worked in the field of domestic violence, mental health for 7 years, give or take. I started my journey, believe it or not, when I was 20. I worked at a domestic violence shelter. I was drawn to it. I'm not entirely sure how that ended up in that way, but then I actually went through an abusive relationship myself, so it became very personal. After that, I started working in shelters with advocacy groups. I worked at the Rape Crisis Center and also did some inpatient and outpatient therapy. I got my undergraduate degree. I started with my associates from College, which is a very small women's college in Missouri. And then I went on to Simmons University. As I've mentioned, I'm a registered yoga teacher and I enjoy trauma-sensitive modalities. So that being said, trauma-sensitive yoga is focused on autonomy. So if you're ever watching a class for yoga, you'll never see anyone behind each other. It'll always be in a circular formation, something interesting. My last fun fact, I enjoy running, Orange Theory and yoga, and I work part-time at Lululemon when I need stress relief. So if you want to come see me in Chestnut Hill, that's where I am some weekends. Okay, so to start our presentation, what is domestic violence? I think that's the biggest question. What's the difference between domestic violence and acts of violence? So our first bullet point here, just reading off the slide, domestic violence is a pattern of coercive tactics perpetrators use to obtain and maintain control and power over their partners. I'll turn it to Rafi so she can discuss the second bullet point there as well.
So when the domestic part in domestic violence usually means that The assault or threat by a member of one's family includes spouses, former spouses, people who have lived together, could be a roommate situation, and people who have a child together, or whether they're related by blood, adoption, or law. So there has to be some close, intimate partner relationship with people involved in these situations. Sorry.
Perfect. Adding to that, tactics of control, we mentioned coercive tactics. These include, but are not limited to, this is by no means an exhaustive presentation. This is very much a high-level overview. So we know kind of education is prevention, right? So that's why we're here. So these tactics include physical abuse, emotional and verbal abuse, putting somebody down, threats, isolation, intimidation. It can also include sexual abuse, unfortunately. Okay, so here's a really helpful graphic. I really like this graphic because it shows the cycle. So when you think of a cycle, it is ever present, it continues, there's no start or end. That being said, in the world of domestic violence research, you'll see several different iterations of this. You might see it as a wave metaphor where there's kind of this peak and then it kind of falls and then it peaks again. I like this specific graphic because it shows the 3 different stages. Rafi, would you like to discuss the first?
Sure. So the first stage is the tension or tension building phase. This can be, like described here, the person feels like they're walking on eggshells around their abuser or the person. There might not quite be overt acts of physical violence, but there's a lot of intimidation. That can include, comments about them. That can include throwing things at walls or hitting things around the person, but not directed at the person. These things can, again, create an environment where the person feels kind of like they're in a fishbowl, and they're navigating and treading softly around the person.
Yeah, the second one on there is the actual violence or acute explosion. Mentioning all of this in this cycle does not necessarily mean these things are present in every relationship. So the second one, violence or acute explosion, that's when the violent episode occurs. So something happens, the victim is actually victimized by the abuser, maybe directly, maybe through threats, physical violence. That is the moment where things escalate, followed by the honeymoon phase.
Yes. The honeymoon phase is quite important, and unfortunately we see this a lot in our work. This is usually when the abuser tries to make up for the violence that they've perpetrated against the victim. A lot of times they will buy them gifts, they will apologize profusely, promise it will never happen again, be on their best behavior. These moments in time can last a short period of time or a very long period of time. Usually, again, if someone has, found the strength to come and report the violent incident to either the police or to someone else or even family members, the abuser, will be on their best behavior afterwards to try and prove, oh no, I'm really a good person, I didn't mean that, that was just a one-time occurrence, it's not going to happen again, you don't have to worry.
So a little note at the bottom in bold, the cycle of violence often depicts episodic, sporadic patterns of abuse. So looking from other research studies that I've kind of delved into in presenting this, abuse is ongoing, constant, and without pattern. So even though this is a cycle, it doesn't mean it has to fall in any specific type of pattern. It's omnipresent and continuous. This is a great graphic as well. This is the Wheel of Power and Control. This was originally created in Duluth, Minnesota. This guy was one of the first graphics we had to describe domestic violence. Personally, I don't use it all that often. It's pretty heteronormalized. It's meant for couples who identify as straight. That being said, if anything in this wheel stands out to you, so let's say using intimidation, making her or him afraid by using looks, actions, or gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons. If any of those, in your head, as a survivor, you came in and I read that to you, and you said, yeah, one of those did happen, okay? You are most likely in an abusive relationship. That's how I describe it to make it really interactive and easy for people to understand. All of this thrown at you, I think, in previous moments, people used to think you had to have a check mark on every single thing. And if you didn't have a check mark, it wasn't good enough, right? It wasn't violent enough. That's not the case.
Okay. Right now we're going into describing legal options for victims and survivors. There's something called a 258E, which is a harassment prevention order, and a 209A, which is a restraining order. So a lot of people have heard, the word restraining order. What I try and tell survivors often is it's actually a great tool for the police when it comes to protecting survivors against their abusers. A lot of survivors come up to us and say, well, it's a piece of paper, it's not going to mean anything, and we tell them actually it gives us absolute right of arrest for someone if they violate that order and continue to either abuse you or contact you if you've asked for them to stop doing so. So again, what we described earlier as intimate partner violence, anyone who has that kind of intimate partner relationship with someone you live with, someone you're married to, someone who's your child, a roommate situation, you would qualify for a 209A. Which is, again, preventing most often contact and abuse legally for the victim or the survivor in this case. 258E was created for people who don't fall within that relationship. So, there are tons of situations that exist in our world today. Maybe a situation between you and your boss, or between you and someone on the street, a stranger, someone you do not know or have any sort of personal relationship with. If they, again, commit 3 or more acts towards you of harassment or violence, you can get an HPO against that person as well. All of this is something that both me and Julie are very knowledgeable about. Most advocacy centers are too, and they usually are happy to go over all of these points for you if you have any questions about them.
So here's a common question that I think I have heard, I want to get the number right, probably 1,000 times in my career. So why do victims stay? That is the question. So as Detective Oliveria said, we do this work every day. We understand why a victim might be forced to stay. People out and about in Coolidge Corner, in the real world, may not have had that experience. That being said, there's tons of barriers for victims leaving abusive relationships. In fact, actually the statistic when victims decide that they want to leave an abusive relationship, the average number of times it takes to actually leave that relationship is 7. That's a really high number, 7 times. In those times, it could have been moments where the person tried to leave, maybe the person threatened, okay, if you don't come back, I'm going to destroy all your things. Okay, the person returned. The person left again. If you don't come back, I'm going to kill your pet. The person returned. These are just some examples. I won't get completely into it. Like I said, this is by no means exhaustive, but it's important to understand that there are so many reasons why someone chooses to stay. In fact, in the majority of situations that we see, I'd say roughly the majority, it's not safe for the person to leave. So if they're deciding to leave, they're really putting their life on the line. And in fact, the most dangerous time for a survivor of domestic violence is right after they leave an abusive relationship. Something to be aware of. Rafi, did you want to add anything to this guy?
Just again, pointing out financial, emotional, and psychological. Economic dependence, a lot of times in these situations, the survivor who's trying to leave, is financially dependent on their partner. They don't, know where they're going to go, where they're going to stay. Maybe they share children together. It creates a very, troubling situation for them, and usually makes it harder in those situations for them to leave. And usually their abuser knows this and uses this against them. These things can also translate, like we said earlier, to LGBTQA and toward immigrants in a lot of these cases. When it comes to the wheel that we discussed before about the Duluth wheel and power and control, when someone's trying to leave, a lot of times someone will threaten to report them. If you leave, I'm going to threaten to report you to ICE. If you leave, I'm going to out you to your family and to your friends if they haven't, come out as LGBTQA. So it's again, all of these are really coercive and can keep someone in a situation a lot longer than they intend.
In fact, some of the research that I have done and specific trainings, the real question we should be asking is not why do victims stay, but why doesn't he just leave? That's what we really should be asking. And the reason is, okay, this person is probably benefiting from the abuse in some way. By abusing this person, by and large, we are seeing women who are more abused than men. That is not always the case. The reason is that abuser is probably benefiting in some way by abusing this person. That's what we talk about when we say that domestic violence is this carefully laid trap. It's not random. It's carefully laid, carefully planned out. Calculated is a word you hear very often in domestic violence. So this was just a graphic from when we were going through the pandemic. So I did a little bit of research on this. I was actually working in domestic violence when the pandemic hit, and the explosion that we saw is absolutely irrevocable. It's hard to explain how much of an impact the pandemic had. So with COVID-19 telling everyone, you have to stay home, you have to be home, home was where a lot of abusers were. That's unlimited access. That doesn't mean that's a safe thing to do. If you were ever on a Zoom call and you saw someone do this gesture, that actually meant that they were in an abusive relationship and they were asking for help. Unfortunately, it wasn't super widespread. I remember seeing it on social media a couple times. Some people were able to use it and get out of their abusive relationships, some were not. So even looking at this graphic, at the time of 2020, 2021, I was working with the YWCA in central Massachusetts. I was a shelter advocate. So the stay at the YWCA was usually 6 to 12 months. They really tried to keep people in shelter for under 12 months. That was the focus. That was what the funding was. So during the COVID pandemic, that stay became 18 months. So from trying to get people in and out of shelter for under a year, it became upwards of a year and a half. And still, there were people that had been there for 2 years, 3 years, because there were no housing options. It wasn't safe. They couldn't go and tour apartments, right? Everything was virtual. All of these barriers came up, specifically in lockdown. It became a very unsafe world for a lot of women who were experiencing intimate partner violence.
Yeah, just to comment on that more, we saw an increase in calls on domestics during that time with police response. Also, if you think about it, a lot of places where, you might make a report for, a suspect, if you suspect there is abuse happening in a house, it would either be at school or at a doctor's visit or through some other avenue. We saw an increase in, child abuse cases, different types of, again, intimate partner family violence during that time period because things weren't being reported. People weren't making home visits. Social workers were not visiting, homes. They were not going to and from places. And no one was seeing the kids or, the wives or the husbands. So, there was no witness to anything that was going on. It was all happening inside the house. And if you did manage to see someone on Zoom, again, there were a few calls that I remember hearing over the Boston radio for, actual acts of violence being committed on Zoom, school sessions and, Zoom meetings with different therapists. So it was definitely happening behind the scenes.
And there's definitely a positive to the world of Zoom and accessibility, right, for people who maybe don't have access to attending something in person. But just like what Detective Oliveria said, highlighting that is what gave access to abuse, right? Putting someone in one space and saying, actually, you can't leave. Not only are we stripping their autonomy, which is a very important part of control, but we're saying you literally cannot leave. This is the place that's supposed to be safe for you, and now it's very unsafe, but you can't leave. You can't go anywhere. So thinking about the impact of that is pretty impactful. Okay, so these are some red flags and warning signs. I like to put these out on a slide because oftentimes we hear other people say them, but we don't pick up on them. Something that I think about as someone who is in this field is, do I hear these things often? Do I hear them from my friends? Do I hear them from my family? First one, when he or she isn't drinking, he is the nicest person. It's a pretty common one. People like to remove substance use from domestic violence, which is actually a very dangerous thing to do because all of a sudden you're saying, well, you're not abusive unless you're drinking. That's not necessarily the case. This could have been a worse incident while this person was drinking. That doesn't mean that they're not abusive. In the field of domestic violence, those two, domestic violence and substance use, are pretty siloed. The point of social workers like myself is to actually still highlight the violence that is omnipresent, right? It doesn't matter what outside force is coming in. It doesn't matter what substance is coming in. It's still there.
Another big one, especially when it comes to identifying domestic violence situations, is I'm not really abused. He or she has never hit me. So again, I've had some recent cases involving restraining orders where again someone has come in and told me about kind of their history with their spouse, and them trying to leave, trying to file for divorce, trying to get out of the situation because they feel like they're living in a fishbowl with this person. This person has made them feel unsafe many, many times, and they did qualify for a restraining order, but we both agreed that this person, was too smart to just not, they had never actually hit them. And, that person was too smart to do that, but, they were, again, creating an environment of coercive control where, again, this person felt like they couldn't leave and was having a really, really difficult time speaking about all the instances of, threats and violence towards them that were not necessarily, again, leading up to criminal charges, but definitely enough for a restraining order, which we were actually able to secure for them.
And that's a really important piece of why we are doing this presentation. Education helps prevention. So the more you know about something, the better you can point it out and maybe have a reaction to it, maybe help somebody else. So as we were working with this particular survivor, mentioning things to her and her saying, wow, I never thought of it like that, her being able to then point that out, she also has children, being able to explain that to her children and raise them in a way where they can point out and notice these things is hugely important and impactful. It's a very salient reason why we do this work. So as Detective Oliveria mentioned previously, LGBTQ intimate partner violence has seen, it's not by any means something that is talked about enough. So at the bottom here, we see in this graphic, which is quite interesting, bisexual women actually have the highest rate of experiencing intimate partner violence. So if we're thinking about that statistic, if we're kind of bringing some life to it and questioning, well, why is it? Why is that statistic like that? At the bottom, there is a stigma of bisexuality and also an invisibility, right? There's the argument that person is not gay enough. That's always been something that we've talked about. There's the sexualization of bisexuality. I think about specifically bisexual women very much being othered. When I say othered, part of the population, but not really, right? Okay, well, she's bisexual, but like she's not really gay, right? These are things that we've heard. This is all over mainstream media. Specifically the sexualization of bisexual women. If we think about that, and someone identifies as bisexual, and their partner is the same sex, obviously they're not going to want to tell someone about it if the person's reaction is to sexualize them. Makes sense why it would be underreported as well. Okay, so just some visual representations. We did use the Wheel of Power and Control, this time the LGBTQ plus version. Rafi, if you want to discuss that one.
Yes, so as I was mentioning before, one of the forms of coercive control in this sense can be someone who maybe isn't quite yet out to their family and to their friends or to their coworkers. Threats to expose them, threats to out them, in this case, again, can be used to keep someone in that kind of control, to keep someone in a relationship. When it comes to, especially, transphobia also, we see a huge uptick in that because a lot of times, a lot of people don't really understand, what being trans is. And it's a very, it's talked about a lot in mainstream media. A lot of the things put out there are false or inaccurate demographically. But a lot of times, it's a very unsafe place for a lot of people who identify as trans. And maybe, again, they're not completely out to their family. And, that can keep them in a situation where someone can have control over them.
And just a plug here, if you or someone you know is experiencing something related to domestic violence and identifies as trans, there are many resources, specifically in Massachusetts. The biggest one I want to point out is Trans Health. It's located in Northampton, Mass. Trans Health is huge, very well known in that community. Just an opportunity to put that out there so that you can say, oh, I've heard of Trans Health, as we continue our presentation. Okay. So Black, Indigenous, people of color face DV at disproportionate rates. That's not a surprise. That being said, it's underreported. It happens all the time. In fact, the rate of Black women being killed by a man compared to white women is actually 3 times higher. So when we think about femicide, domestic violence is one of the leading causes for femicide, so death of women, specifically murder of women. And in the BIPOC population, which stands for Black, Indigenous, people of color, that rate is 3 times higher. So again, a really salient example of how this manifests in different ways. On the right here, this was a graphic that I found in regards to Asian American and Pacific Islander awareness. I believe that is this month, actually. Yes, beautiful. All right. So 16 to 55% of Asian women report experiencing physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. Again, 16 to 55% is a huge statistic, quite a jump as well. But these things are often underreported. If we're thinking culturally, maybe that's not okay to discuss. There are many different reasons why someone would choose not to report it. There's many reasons someone would live through it and then maybe talk about it years later when someone says something to them. Okay, domestic violence and TBI, traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is a very interesting field of study. I think it's fascinating. We still know so little about the brain. We actually know more about football players and their traumatic brain injuries than we do domestic violence survivors and their brain injuries, which they actually have higher rates for survivors of domestic violence who have experienced TBI over football players, which is very interesting. Something about TBI that I think is important is that over 75% of domestic violence victims suffer from it. It's usually underdiagnosed. So a TBI can happen when your airway is cut off. A TBI can happen when someone has repeatedly struck your head. Maybe you've had repeated concussions. If you fell, if you were thrown into a wall, this is all information that could cause traumatic brain injury. The second one on there, repeated TBI can lead to CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the same phenomenon as we have seen with people like Aaron Hernandez, who then went on to actually murder somebody, which is interesting to bring up because this piece of domestic violence is not spoken about enough.
It's also, I think one of the main reasons it's also not researched enough is because, how often, when it comes to CTE, a lot of these things aren't discovered until, after the person has already passed at an autopsy. So again, how many victims of domestic violence who either, did, talk about their story, talk about their survival, how many of them are getting autopsies and having their brains, looked at after the fact? So we actually don't know what the real numbers are when it comes to this.
So Detective Oliveria and I were fortunate enough to be sent to San Diego recently in April for the End Violence Against Women International Conference. And one of the seminars that I took was focused on traumatic brain injury. And something that I learned is that people often will lie about how they sustained this injury. So it might change from, oh, I tripped over a family pet. Why would you ever trip over a family pet if you are a 45-year-old woman? And this pet has been in your life for 10 years. It doesn't make sense. Oh, I fell down the stairs. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've fallen down the stairs, and I'm very clumsy. So that should tell you something. These are little factors and red flags that we hear where we think something doesn't add up here. So I like to bring this specific slide when Detective Oliveria and I go to the high school. If you look on the far right-hand side, that is Julia Fox in what was called the grip dress. This was at the Oscars. So if you see it, it's actually a hand grabbing around her throat. What does that tell us about how strangulation is romanticized in our world? It's taken as a joke, right? It's taken lightly. nothing to be taken lightly. In fact, first point on here, carotid arteries blocked for as little as 6 to 9 seconds can cause unconsciousness, which can then cause permanent brain damage.
So again, one of the main reasons we also like to talk about this, and I don't know if we're going to be moving on to another slide when we talk about language when it comes to strangulation, but saying the word strangulation is really, really important. Not the word choked, choking. A good example that Julie likes to use is choking on one's food. When something goes down their throat, that's not the same thing as someone, deliberately putting their hand across your neck and, trying to constrict your airflow. Again, these are really important little differences that we like to make, really useful further down the line when it comes to, trial, for, really important for police officers to know when it comes to language to use in their police reports.
So later on in our presentation, we do have a quick video, and it is about strangulation, which you'll see. And the last quote for the video says, "You can't consent to something that will kill you." So the question from Yolanda was, did this not raise some concern with the grip dress specifically? Yeah. There was. This was several years ago, but that being said, it's not the first time that we've seen this romanticized. Specifically, if we're looking under the bullet point that says coercive control and the use of power. So I did a little bit of research on abusers because I was curious. And this is a quote actually from an abuser who used strangulation as a tactic and actually did end up committing femicide. This was in prison. This person has been locked up. That being said, they said, "There's no better way to get her full attention, especially when she realizes it could end her life in a snap," literally. Thinking about the ways that that speaks about misogyny, control, power, everything that we've been talking about in this presentation. But that is specifically from an abuser who used strangulation and believed that, yeah, absolutely, of course that's how I control my intimate partner. So here is the video that we were discussing.
Hello?
Hey, what's up?
Hey Tracy, what are you doing?
Nothing. I'm just on Bender right now.
Ooh, what do you see?
There's a couple guys.
Anyone you like?
This guy's kind of cute.
What's on his profile?
It says he has a dog, he likes to work out,
Okay.
and it says he likes girls that like to be choked.
Oh, are you into that?
I don't know, it could be fun.
Are you sure?
Where oxygen.
We are now into the third day of testimony for Daniel Clay. He's the man accused of killing Chelsea Brock. He says he was choking her while the two had sex.
Choking someone out for sexual pleasure, you're towing a line that to me as an ER doctor is one that should not be towed.
One man is being questioned by police following a homicide near Desert Inn in Decatur. Right now, investigators are trying to figure out exactly what happened, but they say the death was caused by a potential sex act.
She went quiet, so I thought at first she was like holding her breath or something, or because I wasn't choking her that hard, I didn't think, and then
So again, a pretty intense example of strangulation. The last line on there, yes, strangulation is a felony. Another reason that we prefer that specifically the officers, when taking reports, use the term strangulation and not choking. Makes it a little bit easier to move the case forward to actually prosecute for that. There are trainings that I have been a part of where someone will say, yes, he choked me. Okay, so he put his hands down your throat. He put something in your throat. Different situation, just like Detective Oliveria said, than cutting off someone's airway, which is what strangulation truly is.
Sure, yeah. So we're going to do a case example. This is, again, names have been changed in the situation. We're working with someone right now who is a 42-year-old female. She has 2 kids, ages 3 and 8, with the abuser. She has been with this abuser for a very long time. They were high school sweethearts. The relationship ended previously, but the two have been off and on again for a very long time. There have been multiple cases where the abuser, again, has abused the victim in this case, not all reported. In this most recent case, this past fall, the abuser, while on an electronic monitoring bracelet and with an active restraining order, gained entrance to the victim's home via a sliding glass door and went into her home. He assaulted her, and he attempted to hit her with a belt. And he was found in the apartment by police. She was able to call the police, and he was found right in the upstairs bedroom. So again, this is a case we are working currently. We, are in ongoing, court and criminal proceedings when it comes to this. We're going to get into kind of the nuances of this situation because, again, these cases last a very long time in criminal court. A lot of times the abusers are kind of counting on that to kind of wear out the victim when it comes to, litigation, and when it comes to hearings, and when it comes to compliance, and when it comes to extending orders. Personally, I know that I, have worked with this victim in particular to, again, extend their order via Zoom hearings, make sure they show up on time for certain things because it's very, it's exhausting. And I think, again, Julie can speak more to that because she has a good relationship with this survivor that we're working with.
Sure. So this was actually my first case when I came on to the DV unit, I think maybe a week after I had started, so we really jumped right in. Something to note is that the abuser being in her home, very much a violation, so he was able to be arrested. A highlight of the officers with their training, knowing domestic violence, knowing this specific victim, they actually asked her, "Is he here?" She said no, and they proceeded to search the house and find him. If they hadn't gone those extra, 2 seconds, who knows what would have happened. Something else to keep in mind is that, yes, women do kind of go back and forth with abusers. We wouldn't only be in a relationship with someone if it was all horrible, right? We think about that cycle of abuse, the cycle of violence. We saw the honeymoon stage. There are times when someone is really wonderful. Maybe they're a big help with the kids, right? Maybe even having them there is huge. Maybe you don't have any family in the area. Maybe they're the one person you know. So you're able to put all of that aside, which is your life, and actually just dismiss it because you need help in other areas. This case is really, really important to think about, especially for me. As a social worker, one of the biggest things that we're doing specifically with survivors is sitting with them and providing space. I don't have the ability to go and make an arrest like Detective Oliveria could. I can't fix that problem, right? Which is one of the most uncomfortable things about this work, is that it is so ongoing and it continues. And as it continues, sometimes the best you can say is, "Did you eat something today? Can I get you water?" Right? And some days that just feels worse than others. So on the left here, this is visible signs of strangulation. They're little things. So in the ears, you'll have that ringing sound. You might even see what's called petechiae, which is actually like blood vessels that have popped. You might see that. That's something that is actually noted in police reports. There'll be usually pictures attached. You might notice difficulty breathing. Someone might report having a sore throat. These are all going to be red flags. Maybe if their voice is kind of hoarse, these are all coming up as red flags for possible strangulation.
So again, when it comes to marginalized groups, we mentioned a few before earlier. We also want to talk about the Orthodox Jewish community in domestic violence because we do have a good population of Orthodox Jewish in Brookline. So just kind of a little background on that. So There is a Boston Hasidim headquarters here, and a lot of people have both temples here in Brookline and in Boston. I know that there is a community in the Brighton area of Hasidic Jews that live there. In Hasidism, there is not a formal education regarding sexuality, consent, or sexual relationships. A lot of times when we get references from different advocacy groups, a big one that we work with often is
Journey to Safety.
Journey to Safety. A lot of times, a lot of the signs that we would see with domestic violence are brought up kind of in community settings and family settings, and there's no outlet for people to talk about these things. There's no outlet to talk about sexuality or not only just orientation, but about sex in general. And words for things, in the domestic violence community, words just talking about violence in general, talking about coercive control, talking about, threats, acts of violence isn't something that is done, and also is something that can be kept within the community and not, shared outside of that community. A lot of times in these cases, the culture itself is highly patriarchal. A lot of the rabbis encourage wives to preserve the marriage in these situations and encourage the women to maintain, the family, and to maintain, keep everything within the community. A lot of times, because again, there's no formal, education about, sexuality and relationships, a lot of people feel like they can't leave in those situations. They can't go out and find another place to live. They can't go out and tell people, in the, hospitals or the schools. Everything's kept kind of separate, and that, again, creates an environment where abuse, unfortunately, can flourish.
One of the things on here, you'll see the fourth bullet point on the left here. What is called a get is a document in Jewish law which constitutes a divorce. So one of my favorite superstars, her name is Keshet Starr, and she's an esquire, she's an attorney in the Orthodox community. She spends a lot of her time in her work appearing at abusers' houses with other women and saying, give her the get, give her the divorce. She brings a lot of noise to something that is often kept in the silence. Okay, so this is an interesting piece as well. So talking about domestic violence in the elder population. Biggest thing to know, it is very prevalent and super underreported. Looking at the first bullet point there, frequently underreported due to fear of financial instability, loss of healthcare benefits, and even homelessness. Medical professionals find it difficult to diagnose a violent incident as symptoms of DV, right? If someone comes in with bruising, confusion, or dissociation, that can occur for the older population without presence of DV. How can we separate those two things? How can we have more education so that we know what's the difference between someone maybe taking a fall and hurting their shoulder versus someone being grabbed and having fingerprints and bruising that matches fingerprints?
A lot of times also in these situations, sometimes the abuse is happening at the hands of the person's own family, sometimes their children. In these situations, a lot of times, sometimes the children are power of attorneys, or they're the ones who are, providing the care that, for their elderly parent. And this can create a situation where, again, coercive control, keeping them in this situation where they feel like they can't report, or they're going to lose their housing or lose things.
And tragically, many domestic violence advocacy groups do focus on adult populations. They're not focusing on senior citizens. So those ranges are between age 18 to 45, which is leaving out a huge population, if you think about it. But that being said, myself as a social worker, Detective Oliveria as a police officer, we're mandated reporters. If you tell us something, we have to do something about it. That being said, there are many different resources. Actually, putting this in our presentation is a huge piece of education, because if we are sitting here and perhaps you are sitting across the room from a friend and you notice different behaviors that could be qualified as abusive, or maybe something happened to them, now you know for the future. So this is a description of what we do on a day-to-day basis when we go on calls. So you heard Detective Oliveria say domestics. I'll pass it to her so that she can describe kind of what we do, what it looks like.
So like we said, a lot of these domestic calls usually happen in the home and usually happen in the evening time, usually when everyone's come home from work and from school. So again, myself and Julie, we usually work from 8 to 4. Sometimes we do go into the evening, so we do not always get a domestic during the day. Sometimes we do on the weekends. Like I said, usually a lot of what we're doing is follow-up work. Again, within the first few weeks of Julie working with us, we did actually get a chance to go on an actual call. So a domestic happened during the daytime, and I think it was during a school vacation week, so everyone happened to be home. So again, usually by the time I show up again with Julie, the threat has been neutralized. Usually, the 911 call has come in, and patrol officers, uniformed officers have gotten to the scene. They've separated the parties. They've tried to determine who the aggressor is in the situation. Maybe the person has already been arrested and removed. Again, in that case, I'll use that case as an example. Usually emotions are still way up here, where, the person is still kind of in fight or flight mode. The person's anxious. There's a bunch of uniformed officers in their house. They don't know where anyone else is. Sometimes their children are home. In this case, again, a lot of what we did was kind of just get them to stabilize and come back to, a base level where they could, put themselves in a position to even, say words and speak to us about what had occurred.
Yeah, precisely as Detective Oliveira said, we're spending so much time just sitting with them. We are in their environment, which is a very uncomfortable situation. Even when you have a guest over and you've invited them over, we were not invited into this apartment, right? We were very much not called and, okay, come at 2 p.m. This is the day before Thanksgiving, right? There's a ton of different things going on. So not only is it uncomfortable, the victim, felt like she hadn't cleaned up. She felt like she was trying to move things around. There's a lot of emotion. And the point of our role is not to push the restraining order, right? At no point am I walking in saying, okay, here's my checklist, I do this and I leave. No, that wouldn't be helpful and it wouldn't be impactful. Specifically as we're waiting for someone's fight or flight response to kind of, take its course, when we think about specifically in neuroscience, we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. So our parasympathetic nervous system, much like a parachute, is meant to bring us back down. The sympathetic nervous system is meant to react. What we call in psychology that lizard brain, where we have imagining a saber-toothed tiger running at us, which we know that's not happening in today's world. But basically the threat is there. That's where fight or flight comes in. So our job is to kick in that parasympathetic nervous system and give them space if they'd like to discuss, and then present them with options. It's very much not a quick process, and it doesn't always end in someone deciding to get a restraining order. There have been times where it has, and there have been times where it has not. As with all of the domestics that come in, say, after this situation, I'm following up with the victim and I'm asking, would you like to get a restraining order? Would it be helpful for you to come to the police department? I met with her several times and the restraining order was not on the cards for her. It wasn't a safe option. She didn't have family here. She was financially dependent on him. And I said, okay, your name is on my desk now. I have a file and you've come across my radar. Which means not only am I going to be texting you like, hi, checking in, but the police department knows the abuser. Unfortunately, he did go through the court system. She chose not to testify, and the case was dismissed. Sounds super frustrating, I know. That was a tough day. It was also March when everything was like gray and disgusting in Massachusetts. But we don't base our successes off of the criminal charges. We don't base our successes off of whether or not someone gets a restraining order. In fact, I base my success off of someone saying, I'm a survivor of domestic violence. Thank you. Things like that. So we previously discussed all of the stuff on here. Way at the bottom here, RO applications can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to complete. Let's say that you come in at, this actually was my Friday, say you come in at 11 a.m. and I'm walking you through the paperwork answering questions. By the time we actually start to fill it out, maybe it's 12 o'clock. The court pauses for lunch at 1, so we have an hour to get that information, give it to the clerk's office, and then we wait. There's a lot of waiting in court. With that being said, that can be really frustrating. Imagine having to take off work, having to find childcare, having to explain to someone if you want to, oh, pardon me, I have to go and run over to court. I won't make our 2 p.m. meeting, right? It's a lot of personal information that you're giving someone. Not everybody wants to do that, and that's okay. That's totally okay. I also put this in here, Rafi. Okay. So House Bill 4241, an act to prevent abuse and exploitation. This is a bill that was actually passed. It's moving its way forward. Myself and Rafi did a lot of work here. This is actually us at the State House on Advocacy Day in March. We were thrilled to attend. This modification adds in language of coercive control into the existing restraining order application. As Rafi mentioned, it is not always physical abuse. Therefore, coercive control can mean many different things and can actually make many more people make their situation applicable for a restraining order. So it changes things a lot. It's a step forward in providing equity and actually tackling this thing of domestic violence. Did you want to add anything, Raf?
No, just that your second bullet point, it also criminalizes revenge porn with a sentence of jail time for 2.5 years. Believe it or not, Massachusetts was one of the few states that did not have that written in there already. And revenge porn, just to explain what that is, if any videos or photos, intimate photos were taken in a relationship, and after you broke up or after you got divorced, that person uses that content without your permission and either posts it online or posts it somewhere or tries to sell it anywhere. Again, that can be seen as revenge porn.
So moving to the more hopeful pieces here, what can be done? While we were in in San Diego on the conference, you'll see at the bottom just a description of the photo. This is Mark Wynn. He is a huge player in the world of domestic violence. He actually grew up in an abusive household. Once he started speaking about it, everything changed for him. He actually, specifically when we were in one of his seminars, he described trying to kill his father when he was 14 by putting arsenic in his drink, and he watched his father throw up a couple times and then go back to sleep, and he was fine. So mentioning that because he was so frustrated that he couldn't help his mother. He was watching his mother be abused. He was getting abused every day. So he turned it into his career. He works with a lot of law enforcement officers and basically discusses the stigma, discusses what domestic violence is, what it looks like in the home. So Start by Believing is a campaign that was created by EVAWI, which is End Violence Against Women International. That's what we went for at the conference. So something to notice here, literally as it says, start by believing. If we start by believing our victims and our survivors first, they will know that. They'll feel that difference. So when we hear survivors tell us what happened, they often pick out little things that someone else might not notice. If you think about a crisis, maybe there was one thing you noticed. Maybe there was a beeping sound. Maybe an alarm was going off. Maybe everything was silent. These little discrepancies are things that our survivors pick up on all the time. So that being said, as survivors pick up on things, they can pick up on whether they're being believed or not. We shouldn't have to put them in that situation. So knowing that law enforcement will believe survivors encourages these positive relationships with policing. It encourages people to come forward and disclose and actually get some type of justice, whatever that may mean for them. What I want to point out is the case of Larry Nassar, which happened in Wade County, Michigan, also present at Michigan State University. So Larry Nassar was a doctor for the Olympic gymnasts for some amount of time for USA Gymnastics. I'm seeing some head nods. Yep, we all remember this case. Horrible case. Before that, he worked at Michigan State University. And the first survivor actually came forward in 1996. So the survivor tried to take legal action, tried to move forward, and people didn't believe her. They said, oh, no, you're making it up. He's such a good guy. He's a doctor. Why would he ever? No. Legal action wasn't taken until 2016. A 20-year gap where Larry Nassar had ongoing opportunity to sexually abuse these female athletes. Something to point out is the documentary Athlete A, which is focused on Maggie Nichols, who was the first USA gymnast to come forward and discuss the abuse. Because of that, she was actually blacklisted from the Olympic team. It's an interesting watch. It's very heavy, but it's very important. If you did watch any of the Larry Nassar sentencing, you'll know that every single survivor was offered the opportunity to come forward and speak and give their testimony, which is pretty cool, very impactful. That was on purpose. While we were at this conference, we were able to meet the prosecutors that actually were in charge of this, 3 women who were badass.
Yeah, and just to mention on that, a lot of people believe that, especially survivors and victims are coming in and just, reporting things all the time about their, spouses. A lot of times we hear kind of misinformation and judgment toward the victims. A lot of people going through divorces saying, oh, well, she'll say anything against me, she's just making up stuff about, domestic violence. A lot, like we said, a lot of times it takes at least 7 times for someone to leave. A lot of times, again, the abuse is ongoing and consistent. So usually it's not, the first time that someone threw a glass at the wall that someone is coming in to report something. It's, the 10th, 11th, 15th, 20th thing that has happened. And so again, start by believing, this person likely went through a lot of forms of abuse before they are sitting, in our police station asking to be heard on something. People do not, everyone thinks people lie about this, but they do not lie about this. A lot of times it's really hard for them to sit in that chair and tell someone intimate details about someone's relationship with someone else or intimate things that have happened to them.
And just as Detective Oliveria said, people like to think that there are these false disclosures. That's actually not the case. Actually, the difference is that more men are believed to be falsely victimized instead of actually having been the perpetrator than women are to come forward and falsely disclose, which is a very important thing to be aware of. So as we come to a close of our presentation, it's kind of one of those things where it's a mile long and an inch deep because there's so much to talk about. But I want to highlight the importance of language, the importance of self-care. This is heavy work. Self-care is important. Taking care of ourselves is important. It's what sustains us. It's what allows us to keep moving forward. You'll notice that Detective Oliveira and I kind of used some different language throughout the presentation. Deciding to use the term survivor versus victim is a very personal choice. It really depends on who you're sitting across from. If someone is ready and accepting and moving forward and feeling confident and wants to use the term survivor, we usually mirror that language. Same is said for a victim. If someone feels victimized and is getting their kind of healing journey from that, that's what we will use. We will always mirror them. Self-care in this little graphic here, it's important to think of self-care as many different pieces. There's many different types. I know that the term self-care kind of became this buzzword of late, specifically in 2020. Everyone was like, I know how to take care of myself, and then we all had mental breakdowns, and turns out we didn't know a thing about what we were talking about. So, what does that look like for you? Physical self-care, is that moving your body? Emotional, is that going to therapy? Crazy. Is that talking to a trusted friend? Is that talking to anyone, someone who's going to hear you, listen to you, and provide you with the support that you need? Again, many other options, but it's important to not only take time for yourself, but find something that feels like it helps you decompress, right? Because if we are sitting here and we're just a sponge and I'm just holding everything in, I'm not going to be super helpful by the time it's Friday at 3 p.m. and someone comes in and wants to make a disclosure, right? I'm going to be exhausted and be like, okay, I'm out of here in an hour, not listening, right? And I want to be able to listen. I want to be able to show up for people, just as people have showed up for me. Some further resources. I have read all of these books. I am someone who absolutely loves to read, so if you see me at the Brookline Booksmith buying too many books, mind your business. I love the book No Visible Bruises. It's very heavy, but it's very important. Rachel Louise Snyder has a great way of making this personal. She talks about many different situations. Highly, highly recommend. On the right side here, these are all resources available near us. Again, by no means exhaustive, many, many more. I think, is that our last one? Okay. So that will wrap up our presentation, but we are here for discussion and questions. Thank you for giving us the time. It's always wonderful to come and do these things in the community. I think it makes my work feel very impactful. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. I think that there will be a handout at the back table, or did you guys decide to put the handout? There will be a handout or flyer at the back table with some of this information, and you will be getting your minutes from this as soon as from the slides and the minutes. I hope will probably give a full explanation, recap of this really good presentation. Should I take some questions?
A few, yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question or two for our presenters, if you have one? Yes. Yes.
Before you leave, I have to ask you.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little?
No. Before you leave, I have to ask you, how do you, what happens to the batterers besides court? And how do you feel about the Emerge program, which you absolutely did not mention? So.
Yes. So Detective Oliveria has to step out as she's working on another case, but I can absolutely answer that question. So I've actually, yes, the question, and what was your first name?
My first name is Isla. I have a loud voice. I was a social worker for 50 years. I started at shelters in the early 80s when they had just been around for about 10 years. I did this work in Michigan, which is closer to Minneapolis, so I know about the power control wheel. And then for about 25 years, I did batterers intervention. I had like 9 groups going at one time at a Catholic services on the east side of Detroit. And I was surprised that you didn't mention anything at all about it.
Sure. Having done some research on Emerge for myself, unfortunately the numbers are not hugely impactful, which is disappointing. We do want to see people be rehabilitated. Isla's question was, does the Emerge program work? It's called Emerge. It is... Yeah, like how do you move forward?
Like way back when the studies were only 10%.
Yes. So unfortunately,
when I was doing it, I felt like one was better than nothing. And it also, I did substance abuse too. And the batterers intervention felt much more powerful than substance. And I am of Jewish background and had, relatives shot into ditches, and it felt like the only thing in my life that I actually sort of did something to combat all of the abuse of power and control, not just in domestic violence, but in our world also. So given that background, I know that the numbers aren't bad. The guy who did the best studies was from Pennsylvania at the time, and I'm blanking on his name right now. And probably you should give me your card, because I probably have old books, even though they might not be as good to pass on to you.
So, Isla, thank you. Thank you for giving me that question and for giving me that information as well. So the Emerge program is in Massachusetts, and it is what used to be called batterers intervention. So batterers intervention was very much made to address these violent offenders, rehabilitate them, and have them take accountability for their actions. Though I believe that the purpose is important, though I believe that it is necessary, unfortunately, as Isla said, the numbers do not show huge improvement. And part of that can be attributed to the fact that this power and control, this narcissistic tendency, does not just go away. I do believe that everybody has the opportunity to be rehabilitated. I think that's important. But I also think that we need to be giving more resources to the survivor and focusing less on the batterer. This is a man's world. it's true, unfortunately. We need to give more power to women. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you for your work.
One in the back over here. Hi, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I am a social worker here. My name is Sharon Sandalo, and I work with seniors. And thank you for highlighting, the small part about seniors. I think it's very important to talk about abuse in the older populations, and it doesn't have to necessarily be physical abuse. And I think for me as a social worker, I'm very interested in prevention. How do we prevent? How do we prevent abuse in all situations? So for younger people, it would be going to the schools and talking about consent and what's right, sexually, and talking about power dynamics, and really get to people early before they turn out to be, serial abusers. In elder populations, I think it's important for all populations, but in elder populations, I think it's really important to look at what factors lead to abuse. Isolation, not having enough resources, not having social support, cognitive changes amongst, people. And I think it's really important to help people in these situations. It's wonderful that you look at one end, but I love, and I think it's really important to look how we can help prevent these things from happening. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about that, especially in elder populations. Thank you.
Yes, just briefly, I'll respond to that. Part of the work that myself and Detective Oliveria do, where did she go? Oh, she's sitting. Oh, hi, sorry. Is, yes, in prevention. And that looks like, just as you said, consent education, healthy relationships education. We are doing very much micro work, but the macro piece is just as important. If that means educating the larger population so that we avoid these abusive tendencies in the first place, I'm all for it. Absolutely. Prevention work is definitely possible, and there are many pieces that we use throughout the presentation to discuss that. But I think that starting on a very small scale can't be understated, right? Like, we were in the high school for the week of healthy relationships around Valentine's Day. And it's important to start there, even though that's already 17 is pretty late. It starts right from the beginning, right? It's also about talking to parents. How were they raised? What was their narrative?
Okay, thank you very much for coming. This is, I'm sure, an ongoing conversation. Next time the kids involved. And thank you very much. Yes, we would love to have you back for more.